By the late years of World War II, Europe's fields and towns were littered with the broken metal skeletons of war. For American tank crews, some days felt like walking into a storm they could not control. The big problem was one tank in particular, the German Tiger. The Tiger was the kind of machine that froze men where they stood. It looked heavy and terrifying, a moving block of steel. Its armor was so thick that many of the weapons the Allies trusted simply bounced off. Its long 88mm gun could pick off a target from well over a kilometer away. That meant an American tank could be destroyed before it ever closed the range needed to return fire. For crews riding in the M4 Sherman, the backbone of the U.S. Armored Force, that was a nightmare. The Sherman was reliable, quick to fix, and could be built in huge numbers, but it was never designed to take hits from a Tiger head-on. Imagine being in a Sherman on a gray field. Your driver slows. Your loader checks the rounds. You see a flicker of dust far off, maybe a barn collapsing, maybe a troop truck. Suddenly, a flash explodes on the horizon and a column of smoke pops up where your friends were. Before you can aim your gun, metal and fire have already eaten through your hull. That flash? A Tiger's 88. That quick, violent end was what American crews feared. This imbalance pushed the Americans into a hard truth: you could not win every duel by simply building more Shermans. Sometimes you had to change how you fought. You needed something that could reach out and hit a Tiger first, something with a gun that could punch through heavy armor at long range. You needed a new idea, not another tank to slug it out, but a vehicle designed to hunt tanks. Enter the tank destroyer concept. The idea was simple in purpose if not simple in practice: build a fast, heavily armed vehicle whose job was to find and kill enemy tanks. It would not be as armored as a Tiger or a Sherman. Instead, it would depend on speed, cover, and the weight of its gun to survive. The goal was to shoot the enemy from a hidden place, then move before enemy fire could find it. American engineers had a promising answer: the 90mm gun. This weapon was first used against planes and fortifications, but engineers adapted it to fight tanks. The 90mm had power and range. It could send a shell with enough speed and force to pierce the thick steel of a Tiger's front armor, at the right range and angle. But a powerful gun needs a platform, and that platform had to be sturdy enough to carry the weapon while still being mobile. That platform came in the shape of a new vehicle, the M36 Jackson. The M36 was not a tank in the traditional sense. Its crew rode inside a vehicle with much of the gun sitting out in the open atop the hull, in a large open-top turret. This design gave the crew space to handle the heavy 90mm rounds and let the gun turn quickly to face targets. The M36 kept weight down so it could move fast and climb slopes, but it also sported just enough armor to protect the crew from small arms and shrapnel, not a face-to-face fortress like the Tiger, but a clever hunter. The arrival of the M36 changed the mood inside American armored units. Where Sherman crews had often felt like they were close to helpless against Tigers, tank destroyer crews now had a tool that could answer the threat. The M36 let them fight from a distance, using long sighting and strong shells to make hits that mattered. The tactic was to pick a good hiding spot, wait for the Tiger to appear in the open, and then take it at a range where the Tiger's own gun couldn't reply effectively. But technology alone didn't win battles. Men and training mattered just as much. Tank destroyer crews learned to think differently. They were taught to use camouflage, to move silently into a position at dawn or dusk, to pull their vehicle behind hedgerows or inside ruined buildings. When battle began, they fired quickly and then retreated before counterfire arrived. This hit-and-run style was the opposite of the armored slugging matches the Germans expected. The Tiger, powerful as it was less flexible when it had to hunt for camouflaged enemies who struck from hidden corners. Stories from the front show how this new approach worked in practice. In some battles, M36s would lie in wait along likely routes. When a Tiger rolled into view, the M36s opened up with heavy shells. A single, well-placed hit could break through the Tiger's frontal armor, set engine rooms ablaze, or disable the track so the tank could not move. With its heart broken, the Tiger became a static target. Even crews inside a Tiger suddenly found themselves vulnerable when an M36's 90mm round found its mark. There were still dangers. The M36's open turret left crews exposed to shrapnel and small arms, and the vehicle relied on tactics and speed. Mistakes could be costly. In close combat, a Tiger could still rip an M36 apart. Close-range fights were still the Tiger's home ground. That is why M36 crews trained to avoid direct brawls and preferred ambushes at a distance. The psychological impact of the M36 on both sides was important. For American crews, knowing there was a weapon that could pierce a Tiger offered a new kind of confidence. They no longer always had to retreat at the sight of a Tiger. That changed how units positioned themselves and how commanders planned attacks. For German crews, the appearance of reliable Allied anti-tank weapons began to chip away at the aura of invincibility the Tiger had enjoyed. Where once German crews might have laughed at the idea that the Americans could match them, they now learned the bitter lesson that technology and tactics could remove their advantage. Armor and a powerful gun were not enough on their own. By late 1944 and into 1945, tank battles in Europe began to look different. The battlefield shifted from a place where heavy armor alone decided the day to a more complex zone where reconnaissance, positioning, and concentrated firepower mattered. Tank destroyers like the M36 were part of that shift. They allowed Allied forces to challenge German heavy tanks without having to redesign the Sherman or wait for entirely new armored divisions. The M36's role also showed a broader point about modern war: advantage depends on balance. A single, excellent weapon can dominate for a time. But when enemies adapt, that advantage fades. The Tiger was terrifying because it combined armor and firepower in a way that few could match. The M36 answered by changing the rules of engagement: fight smarter, strike farther, and use mobility to stay alive. After the war, veterans on both sides looked back and saw the lessons that had been learned in steel and smoke. The Tiger became a symbol of raw power and the limits of building ever bigger weapons. The Jackson and its 90mm gun showed how flexibility, tactics, and the right tool for the job could restore balance on the battlefield. The war pushed armies to stop thinking only in terms of weight and armor and more in terms of mobility, combined arms, and how different units supported each other. That balance continued to change in the decades after 1945, as new technologies, lighter, stronger armor, better targeting systems, and different kinds of anti-tank weapons, reshaped how armies fought. But for the men who rode in Shermans, Tigers, and M36s during those last years of World War II, the most important lesson was immediate and simple: survival depended on making the right choice fast. If you could shoot first and disappear, you stood a much better chance of seeing the next sunrise. In the end, the M36 didn't make Tigers vanish from history, nor did it end armored warfare in a single bolt. What it did do was give Allied crews a fighting chance against a seemingly unbeatable foe. It turned fear into something that could be fought, and sometimes, in the low light behind a ruined wall or in the smoke of a village street, men with a 90mm gun proved that clever design and bold tactics could beat brutal force. The Tiger remained a terrifying machine, but it was no longer untouchable. And on the fields of Europe, that change meant lives saved, towns won back, and a step closer to the end of the war. It didn't have thick armor like the Tiger. It didn't even have a roof over the turret. The crew was exposed to the open air. But what it did have was speed, accuracy, and firepower. And most importantly, it had reach. By 1943, the Allies had already fought their way across North Africa and were now battling through Europe. But as they advanced, American tank crews started encountering something they had never seen before. A monster on tracks known as the Tiger tank. The first time soldiers saw one, they couldn't believe it. The Tiger was massive, almost twice the weight of a Sherman. Its thick, sloped armor gleamed in the sunlight, and its long 88mm gun looked more like a cannon from a warship than something meant for a tank. When a Tiger rolled into battle, it felt unstoppable. Its engine roared like thunder, its tracks crushed anything beneath them, and every American tanker knew what was coming next. The explosion of another Sherman tank. The M4 Sherman was the main American tank of the war. It was fast, easy to repair, and could be built in huge numbers. That was its strength. But it had one major weakness: it simply wasn't strong enough to face a Tiger head-on. Its main weapon, the 75mm gun, was good for fighting smaller German tanks like the Panzer IV. But against the Tiger's armor, especially on the front, it was almost useless. Imagine firing a bullet at a wall of iron. That's what it felt like. The shells from the Sherman would bounce off the Tiger's armor like pebbles hitting a rock. Even when the Americans upgraded some Shermans with a 76mm gun, the difference was small. To destroy a Tiger, a Sherman crew had to hit the side or rear, and even then, it had to be close, dangerously close. Meanwhile, the Tiger's 88mm gun could blow up a Sherman from 1,500 to 2,000 meters away. Sometimes even farther. That meant a Tiger could destroy an entire group of American tanks before the Americans even got close enough to fight back. For the crews inside those Shermans, it was terrifying. They knew that if a Tiger was out there, it could spot them first, fire first, and most likely kill them first. Even a single Tiger could hold off several American tanks at once. Many tank battles turned into one-sided hunts, but the Americans were the ones being hunted. Crews developed desperate tactics. Trying to flank the Tiger to shoot at its weaker sides. Calling for air support from fighter bombers to destroy it from above. Or even avoiding open ground, where the Tiger's long-range gun could pick them off easily. But no matter how hard they tried, the fear never went away. Every time a Tiger appeared, morale dropped instantly. Some tankers even gave the Tiger a nickname, the Beast. It wasn't just a machine. It was a symbol of German dominance. By 1944, Allied commanders knew something had to change. They could win the war through sheer numbers, by sending more Shermans than the Germans had bullets. But that meant more American lives lost. They needed a gun that could fight back. A weapon powerful enough to punch through the Tiger's armor at long range, not just get close and hope for luck. But that was easier said than done. German engineers had started making even stronger tanks, like the Tiger II, or King Tiger. It was slower but even more heavily armored, and its gun was even deadlier. If the Tiger was a nightmare, the King Tiger was the apocalypse. The Allies were desperate. They needed something that could level the playing field, a weapon that could finally make the Germans feel fear. At this stage, American engineers and military planners began to rethink how they built their vehicles. If they couldn't match German armor inch for inch, maybe they could beat it another way. Through speed, accuracy, and firepower. That's when attention turned to a powerful gun that already existed, not for tanks, but for anti-aircraft defense. It was a 90mm cannon, originally designed to shoot down enemy planes at high altitude. The 90mm gun changed everything. At first glance it seemed like a small idea, faster shells, more energy, but in war, small ideas that actually work can change how men fight and how battles are won. The story of the M36 Jackson is the story of one of those ideas, taking a powerful tool built for one job, reshaping it for another, and using speed, brains, and a little stubbornness to close a gap on the battlefield that had cost American soldiers dearly. Before the M36 arrived, American tank crews carried a growing dread. Across fields and hedgerows, the German Tiger was a monster of cold metal and terrifying performance. Its frontal armor was thick enough that most Allied guns simply bounced off. Crews learned fast: if you saw a Tiger, you either tried to avoid it or you prayed for help. Shermans were reliable and numerous, but against a Tiger's frontal plates they were underpowered. The psychological effect of that imbalance mattered as much as the physical one. Men who expect to be outgunned hesitate. Hesitation costs lives. So when the Ordnance Department started thinking about guns, they weren't just doing math, they were trying to buy time and confidence for the soldiers in Europe. Designing a brand new weapon system would have been ideal in a perfect world, but a perfect world wasn't how wars work. It would take too long. The engineers needed a fast, practical solution that could be produced and put into the hands of crews on the front lines in months rather than years. The breakthrough was less glamorous than you might imagine. It didn't come from a secret prototype factory or a dramatic battlefield capture. It came from a stack of technical reports and a simple, stubborn question: what do we already have that can punch through a Tiger's armor? The answer lay in the U.S. Army's anti-aircraft arsenal. The 90mm anti-aircraft gun had been built to stop high-flying bombers. To hit targets thousands of feet up, the gun needed to fling shells at extremely high speed, far faster than a typical tank gun. That speed meant kinetic energy. A fast-moving shell carries far more energy on impact than a slow one of the same weight. Engineers realized that if those shells could be guided down to strike a tank at a few hundred meters, they might carry enough energy to defeat armor that other guns couldn't. Turning an anti-aircraft gun into a tank gun sounds easy on paper, but it was anything but. The 90mm was big, heavy, and meant to sit on a stable ground mount. Tanks, on the other hand, have cramped turrets and have to absorb massive recoil without toppling or blowing off the turret ring. The engineers had to retrench, shorten barrels, redesign breeches, reinforce mounts, and make everything manageable inside a vehicle. The result of months of testing and tinkering was the M3 90mm cannon, powerful, compact enough to fit into armored fighting vehicles, and accurate at long range. The M3 was a modern weapon for its time. It could fire armor-piercing rounds at velocities that let them hold their punch over long distances. That meant American crews no longer had to get dangerously close to Tigers to have a chance. Distance equalized things. A well-placed round from a 90mm could travel over a kilometer and still carry enough energy to pierce the Tiger's frontal armor. More than that, the M3's accuracy meant fewer wasted shots, so one well-trained gunner could have an outsized effect on an engagement. But hardware alone doesn't win fights. When the Pershing, the American heavy tank meant to carry the new 90mm in a fully armored vehicle, was delayed by production limits, commanders still needed something faster and cheaper to field now. The solution was pragmatic: reuse what the country already had. The M10 tank destroyer, built in large numbers, had a reliable chassis and good mobility, but its 3-inch gun was increasingly impotent against late-war German armor. Swap its gun for the new 90mm, and you get a potent, mobile tank killer assembled from parts that already existed. The result was the M36 tank destroyer, commonly called the Jackson. It was not pretty. The M36 had an open-top turret, crews were exposed to the elements and to shrapnel, and its armor was thinner than a heavy tank's. It relied on speed and firepower rather than thick steel. For many soldiers, that thin, barked-out silhouette that rolled onto the road didn't look like a match for a Tiger. German crews, used to judging enemy armor by silhouette and profile, often saw the M36 and dismissed it as another lightly armored American vehicle. They expected another easy target. What they didn't account for was the 90mm inside its turret. When the M36's gun spoke, it did so with a voice the battlefield had never heard from an American vehicle before. From ranges that would have left Sherman's guessing, the 90mm delivered rounds that punched through armor and detonated inside enemy turrets and hulls. The M36 could hit the Tiger's vulnerable spots from long range. It could do something that no earlier American fielded vehicle could: kill a Tiger on the terms the Americans preferred, at distance, and with fewer exposures. That had immediate tactical consequences. German tankers who had long relied on their superior frontal protection found themselves surprised. Shells they thought would glance off now bit deep and ripped apart engines, crews, and optics. Confidence, as any soldier will tell you, is a fragile thing. Once it breaks, behavior changes. Where German crews had pressed advantage, they now hesitated. Skirmishes that had been lopsided were becoming contests. A single well-aimed M36 could negate an enemy's numerical advantage by taking out or deterring a lead tank. American crews, who had for months been practicing evasive maneuvers and prayer, found a new freedom: they could stand and fight. That psychological shift was as valuable as the physical effect of the gun. War is run on decisions and morale as much as on armor thickness and horsepower. When a platoon of American tank destroyers could look a tiger in the eye and answer with a weapon that could end the fight on the first shot, whole patterns of engagement changed. Infantry moved with less fear of armored overwatch. Commanders could plan bolder counterattacks. Small units began to exploit flanks and firing positions they would previously have avoided. In a way, the M36 bought Americans something harder to quantify than mettle, time, courage, and initiative. Of course, the M36 wasn't a silver bullet. It wasn't heavily armored like the German heavy tanks, and it exposed its crew to additional risks thanks to its open-top turret. It was still vulnerable to artillery airbursts, anti-tank weapons, and simply having its ammunition hit. It didn't replace the need for heavier tanks like the Pershing, rather, it filled a critical gap at a critical moment. It was an emergency fix that paid off in practical, immediate ways. Beyond the battlefield, the M36's story also tells us something about how modern militaries solve urgent problems. Instead of waiting for a perfect design, the U.S. Army repurposed existing hardware and adapted quickly. The anti-aircraft gun, built for skies, became a decisive weapon on the ground. Engineers shortened, reworked, and reimagined what was already available. Production lines stayed moving, crews were trained on equipment that shared parts with older vehicles, and frontline units received a capability that made a concrete difference in months rather than years. And the men who used the M36 mattered too. Good engineering won battles only when matched with skilled crews who knew how to exploit their advantages. Gunners learned to engage at long range, to use terrain, and to work in teams with infantry and other armor. Tank destroyer doctrine, emphasized speed, concentration of fire, and decisive engagement, finally had hardware that could back it up. By late 1944 and into 1945, with increasing numbers of M36s on European roads and fields, the balance in many armored engagements shifted. It didn't end the war for the Allies, of course. Many factors, strategic and political, determined that outcome, but the M36 changed the day-to-day reality for American soldiers facing German armor. It turned fear into a fighting chance, and it proved that clever adaptation could close the gap even against seemingly superior technology. In the end, the story of the M36 Jackson is a simple lesson about war and innovation. The best solution is not always the newest or the heaviest. Sometimes it's the fastest idea that works, the one that takes what's already available and makes it do something it wasn't built for. That kind of cleverness won lives and bought bravery. For the men who watched a tiger burst into flames from a safe distance, it felt less like engineering and more like deliverance. And in war, deliverance changes everything. At first glance, it looked a lot like the M10, same hull, same open turret, but its gun was much larger and far more deadly. The 90mm cannon gave it the ability to destroy even the toughest German tanks from long range. For the first time, American crews could shoot first and stay hidden, instead of charging in and hoping for a lucky hit. When the M36 finally rolled out onto the battlefield in late 1944, it immediately made an impression. German gunners were shocked when their supposedly invincible Tigers and Panthers were knocked out from distances they thought were safe. The M36 wasn't perfect, its armor was still thin, and the crew was exposed to enemy fire because of the open turret. But it wasn't meant to fight like a tank. It was designed to be a hunter, not a brawler. It relied on stealth, long-range shooting, and teamwork. Crews learned to hide behind ridges, fire a few shots, and quickly move to a new position before the enemy could find them. With the 90mm gun, the M36 Jackson turned American tank destroyer units into real threats on the battlefield. And in many cases, a few well-placed shots from these vehicles could change the entire course of a battle. What made this story remarkable was how it showed adaptation in wartime. Instead of waiting for the perfect new tank, the Americans took what they already had. A powerful anti-air gun, an old tank destroyer. And combined them to create a weapon that could finally challenge Germany's best machines. In war, speed and creativity can be more valuable than perfection. And the M36 Jackson proved exactly that. The M36 tank destroyer might not have looked like much at first glance. It shared the same basic shape as earlier U.S. tank destroyers, like the M10 Wolverine. But one big feature set it apart. On top of its hull sat a huge, open-top turret, and inside the turret was the new 90mm gun, the weapon that would finally give American crews a chance to fight back against the Tigers and Panthers. This gun was a monster compared to the older ones. It could pierce through about 160mm of armor at a range of 1,000 meters, which meant it could destroy even a Tiger tank from the front, something that earlier American guns could rarely do. And because the gun fired high-velocity shells, its shots traveled in a flatter, faster path, making it easier to hit distant targets accurately. For American crews, this was a game-changer. They could now engage German tanks from longer distances instead of getting dangerously close. But the M36 wasn't perfect. The M36 Jackson was not a perfect machine. In fact, compared to the German Tiger, it looked vulnerable. Its armor was thin, just thick enough to stop bullets, small shrapnel, and fragments from explosions. But against a direct hit from a Tiger's powerful 88mm cannon, the M36 stood no chance. If a Tiger spotted it first and fired, the M36 would be destroyed instantly. To make things more risky, the M36's turret was open at the top. This design helped the crew load the big 90mm shells quickly and move the gun fast, but it also exposed them. Enemy soldiers could throw grenades inside. Airburst artillery, shells that explode above the ground, could send deadly metal fragments raining straight into the turret. Even rifle bullets could hit the crew if they were unlucky. So the men inside an M36 couldn't depend on armor to stay alive. They had to depend on something else entirely: skill, speed, and surprise. The M36 was not meant to fight like a normal tank. A tank like the Sherman or Tiger could roll into a firefight head-on, trading shot for shot. The M36 could not survive that kind of battle. It was designed to hide, to wait for the perfect moment. It would position itself behind a ridge, inside a tree line, or in the ruins of a destroyed village. The goal was to fire the first shot before the enemy even knew where it was, and then move away quickly before the enemy could aim back. When used in this way, quietly, carefully, and with patience, the M36 became extremely dangerous. Its 90mm gun was powerful enough to pierce even the thick front armor of a Tiger tank at long distances. For the first time, American tank destroyer crews had a weapon that let them face Germany's best tanks, not with fear, but with confidence. They no longer had to wait for a Tiger to get close. They no longer had to try to sneak behind it to hit its weaker rear armor. Now, the Americans could strike first, and win. This new power began to show itself in the autumn of 1944, when the war swept across France and Belgium. German tank units were falling back toward their homeland, trying to slow the advancing Allied forces. Among these retreating units were the feared Tiger battalions. These crews had spent years dominating the battlefield. They were used to destroying American tanks almost at will. So when they heard that the Americans had a new weapon, something called a 90mm gun mounted on a tank destroyer, they were not impressed. To them, this sounded like desperation. They believed no light American vehicle could match the Tiger. The Tiger had thick armor, a powerful gun, and crews who were experienced and confident. The Americans, they thought, were simply trying to catch up, and failing. But the Germans were about to learn that this new weapon was no joke. Somewhere near the Siegfried Line, the defensive barrier along Germany's western border, a group of German Tiger tanks rolled forward. Their commanders expected the same kind of battle they had fought many times before. They assumed they would see American Shermans, knock them out with long-range fire, and keep advancing. What they did not know was that several M36 tank destroyers had taken up positions ahead of them. These M36 crews had chosen their ground carefully. They hid behind hills and among trees, engines off, waiting silently. They didn't move. They didn't reveal themselves. They watched through binoculars as the Tigers approached. When the Tigers came within effective range, over 1,500 meters away, the Americans acted. The order was given. The first M36 fired. The 90mm shell flew fast, almost flat across the field. It struck the turret of the lead Tiger with incredible force, punching straight through the armor. The Tiger shuddered to a stop, smoke rising from inside. The crew either died instantly or scrambled to escape the burning interior. The second M36 fired. Another Tiger was hit. This time, the shell ignited the fuel or ammunition inside the tank. Flames burst out of the hatches. The crew had no chance. The third shot targeted a Tiger near the back of the formation. The shell ripped into its side, damaging its engine and halting it. The crew bailed out, realizing the tank could no longer move or fight. All of this happened in a matter of seconds. The German gunners were caught completely off guard. They couldn't even tell where the shots were coming from. Their tanks were powerful, but useless if they couldn't see the threat. And because the M36s were firing from hidden positions at long range, the Tigers had no targets to shoot back at. The invincible Tigers, the pride of the German armored forces, were being destroyed before they could even fire a single shot in return. The shock was immediate. The German crews, who had once laughed at the idea of the Americans building a weapon strong enough to defeat them, now realized things had changed. This wasn't a Sherman they were facing. This wasn't a weak gun bouncing shells harmlessly off their armor. This was something new. Something dangerous. Something that could kill them. The era of the Tigers' unquestioned dominance was over. Word spread. German tankers started warning each other, "There is an American vehicle with a big gun. Do not let it see you first." Meanwhile, American crews gained something they had not felt in a long time: confidence. They were still careful. The Tiger was still deadly if it got the first shot. But now, the Americans no longer had to fight uphill. The battlefield had become more balanced. The M36 had proven itself, not by overpowering the Tiger, but by outsmarting it. And in war, that can make all the difference. For the American crews, it was a shocking and thrilling moment. For the first time in the war, they finally had a weapon that could stand up to, and even defeat, Germany's most feared tanks at long range. The message spread fast across the front. The Americans now had a gun that could kill Tigers, and the Germans knew it. The success of the M36 Jackson wasn't only because it had a powerful gun, it was also because of how smartly the Americans used it. By 1944, American commanders knew that fighting the Germans head-on was a bad idea. Tigers and Panthers had stronger armor and could take a direct hit much better than any American vehicle. So instead of charging in, U.S. tank destroyer crews learned to fight cleverly, using tactics, speed, and surprise. Here's how they did it. They chose the battlefield. M36s were often positioned on high ground, behind hills, or hidden behind trees and buildings. This gave them a good view of the area while keeping them hard to spot. They waited patiently. The crews didn't move until the German tanks were in sight and within range. When a Tiger or Panther rolled into view, the M36 fired first, from a long distance, before the Germans even knew where they were. They fired and moved. After shooting once or twice, the M36s didn't stay in the same place. They quickly changed position to avoid being hit by return fire. This hit-and-run method made them very hard to destroy. They worked as a team. Artillery and fighter planes often supported the M36s. So even if the enemy tried to counterattack, the Americans could call for shells or airstrikes to cover their escape. This strategy turned weakness into strength. The M36's thin armor no longer mattered because it didn't fight in open duels, it fought on its own terms. One American crew famously destroyed 3 Tiger tanks in one battle without losing a single M36. Their success came from distance, discipline, and that powerful 90mm gun, used with precision, patience, and teamwork. By late 1944, these tactics became standard for U.S. tank destroyer battalions. The Americans had finally learned how to fight Germany's best tanks, not by building a tougher machine, but by fighting smarter. The 90mm gun succeeded for three main reasons. It could fire shells fast enough to punch through even the toughest German armor at long range. It could use different ammunition types, armor-piercing, high-explosive, and even HVAP, high-velocity armor-piercing, rounds, which were extremely effective. The gun's high muzzle speed meant it fired flatter, straighter shots, easier to aim at distant targets. Even German reports after the war admitted that the 90mm gun was one of the few Allied weapons capable of defeating the Tiger II at respectable range. The M36 Jackson didn't instantly make the German Tiger tank useless. The Tiger was still a powerful and dangerous machine. But what the M36 did prove was something very important: good design and smart tactics could defeat even the strongest enemy. For much of the war, American tank crews fought under a dark shadow, the shadow of the German Tiger. Every time they rolled out in their Shermans, they knew the risks. The Sherman was dependable, easy to repair, and could be built quickly, but against the heavy German tanks, it was outmatched. Its 75mm gun, and even the slightly upgraded 76mm, often failed to penetrate the thick, sloped armor of a Tiger or Panther. American rounds would hit and simply ricochet off, leaving only scorch marks on the enemy's steel. The Tiger, on the other hand, could destroy a Sherman with a single shot, sometimes from over a mile away. It was a nightmare that every crewman knew too well. You'd spot the enemy first, open fire, watch your shells bounce harmlessly, and then, seconds later, see a flash and feel the impact that meant your tank, and maybe your crew, were finished. That constant imbalance did something terrible to morale. American tankers were brave, but bravery alone doesn't cancel fear. Many of them started to think of tank battles not as contests, but as survival tests. If a Tiger appeared, most units had two options: call for air support or try to outflank it in groups, hoping to get close enough to hit its weaker sides or rear. It was a risky, desperate way to fight, and it cost lives. Then came the M36 Jackson. When the new tank destroyer arrived in late 1944, it didn't look like much at first glance. The armor was thin, the turret was open-topped, and the design wasn't flashy. But inside that turret was something special: the 90mm gun. It wasn't just another cannon. It was a weapon that changed what American tank crews could dream of doing. The 90mm gun was a beast in terms of power and velocity. It could hurl armor-piercing rounds at incredible speed, and at long ranges, those rounds didn't lose their punch. Suddenly, American crews could do something they had never been able to do before: destroy a Tiger from afar, even from over a kilometer away. This wasn't just a new weapon, it was a psychological breakthrough. For the first time, American crews didn't have to rush headlong into danger or rely entirely on outside help. They could engage the enemy on their own terms. They could find cover, set up ambushes, and use range to their advantage. Instead of being prey, they could become hunters. Imagine being one of those tankers. After months of watching friends' tanks burn, suddenly, you're the one pulling the trigger and watching a Tiger erupt in flames at a safe distance. That moment wasn't just about victory, it was about redemption. It gave crews something far more valuable than just firepower: it gave them confidence. Confidence to move forward. Confidence to take on armored columns they once avoided. Confidence to believe that they could stand toe-to-toe with the most feared tanks of the war. The change in mindset spread quickly. Word traveled fast through the ranks. Soldiers talked about the new 90, about how it could pierce a Tiger frontally, something that had once been impossible. They began to trust their machines again. And when a crew trusts their vehicle, they fight harder and smarter. In many ways, the M36 Jackson didn't just level the battlefield, it restored morale. It made American tankers feel equal again, not like underdogs hiding from superior machines. They could plan, they could fight, and most importantly, they could win. And the Germans noticed. At first, they laughed at it. To them, it looked like another light American vehicle, easy to destroy. But that illusion vanished the moment the first 90mm shells tore through Tiger armor. Reports began to spread across German units. A new American gun was out there, one that could punch through their thickest steel. The reaction shifted from mockery to caution, and then to respect. German tank commanders began warning their crews about the new 90. They were told not to underestimate American vehicles, because now, even from long range, they could kill a Tiger. Some captured German officers later admitted that they had underestimated the gun completely. They had thought the Americans couldn't build anything powerful enough to match the Tiger's strength. The M36 proved them wrong. It's important to understand that wars aren't just fought with bullets and tanks, they're fought with psychology. Fear, confidence, morale, these are as real as armor and gunfire. Before the M36, fear tilted heavily toward the Americans. After it arrived, that balance started to shift. When American crews began winning duels against Tigers and Panthers, it sent ripples through both sides. Every German tank destroyed by a Jackson boosted Allied morale and chipped away at the enemy's confidence. Every victory told the same story: the Americans had finally caught up. Even though the war was nearing its end, this change mattered deeply. For the men on the front lines, every new tool, every bit of hope, counted. The M36 Jackson gave them that hope, not because it was invincible, but because it gave them the power to fight back on even ground. And that, in itself, was revolutionary. The M36 didn't win the war alone. It wasn't produced in massive numbers like the Sherman, and it couldn't replace every vehicle in the field. But its arrival symbolized something greater: adaptation. The Americans had learned from their mistakes, studied the enemy, and found a way to respond, not by building the heaviest tank, but by thinking smarter. It proved that victory doesn't always belong to the biggest machine or the thickest armor. Sometimes it belongs to the side that learns faster, innovates quicker, and uses what it has in the cleverest way. The Jackson was living proof of that. In the end, the M36 didn't just change how American tankers fought, it changed how they felt. They went from being hunted to being hunters. From victims to victors. And long after the last shots were fired, the lessons of that change lived on in every soldier who learned that courage and intelligence could be just as powerful as steel and fire. The M36 Jackson wasn't the most famous tank of the war, but for the men who drove it, it meant everything. It was their answer to fear, and their reminder that even in the darkest moments, innovation and determination can turn the tide.